Hello, my name is Melissa Kaiser. I am a human trafficking navigator for Eastern North Dakota for the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force.
Hello, I'm Dr. Annalena Lundy. I am a nurse and a human trafficking navigator for Western North Dakota. I'm also a certified forensic nurse examiner in adults and pediatrics, and glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you, NDSU, for collaborating with the task force on this project.
So as always, we're going to have some objectives. And as you can see here, some of our objectives, what we would like to do today is have you understand what human trafficking actually looks like in healthcare specifically, because the nuances are different. We also want to identify how a patient, and I'm going to say may present because it's not as obvious, and could it be trafficking or not? And will you have time to do that assessment given the healthcare arena that you're in? And also, let's look at some protocols. Let's look at the way you're doing things now. What can be improved? What should it look like? And how do you report?
So talking about the Human Trafficking Task Force, we started in about 2015 and 2016, hoping to combat human trafficking in North Dakota through multiple disciplines working together in tandem together. So with that, we work with our Attorney General's Commission for funding and for partnership. We focus on response to victims as well as investigations and working collaboratively with victim service provision as well as prosecution and investigation as a full team throughout the entire state.
And what's neat about that is that we not only concentrate, and you probably mentioned this and we'll talk about it, it's just not sex trafficking. We're also looking at the labor trafficking piece, which doesn't get a lot in as far as discussion, but it's something that in the healthcare setting you will see.
Absolutely. So our mission, the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force, is a statewide multidisciplinary collaboration of law enforcement, service providers, prosecution, established to work in a victim-centered manner to prevent, detect, disrupt, and dismantle human trafficking through coordinated, comprehensive services and efficient investigation and prosecution. So like Annalena said, that's for sex and labor trafficking. We work with males and females, youth and adults to combat human trafficking in our state and help victims get to a better space.
And as we all know in healthcare, working in a team environment, this is exactly what the mission of the task force is.
So we bridge gaps in the service world, of course, between medical, law enforcement, service provision with victim service providers. So our goals are to really bridge gaps or barriers we see for clients by working collaboratively. Annalena and my positions are really to help local communities build capacity in response to victims with local protocols, which we'll talk about later. And again, addressing both sex and labor trafficking, and we'll define those in a bit.
Yep. And we always look at prosecution, and we want to prosecute the offenders. But what you'll hear throughout this entire presentation today and in the other days that you're watching this is that success will come in the interventions, not so much the outcomes as we're so accustomed to in healthcare. It's what we do that makes a difference. So sometimes it would lead to prosecution. That is our goal, as it says here, but it's not always the case. And I don't want that to dismay you.
Part of what we do as well is conduct proactive law enforcement investigations of human trafficking in our state. We provide comprehensive services to victims with human trafficking advocates throughout the state, and we prosecute offenders. And like Annalena said, we'll talk a little bit more about the successes and barriers throughout our training. And then the red dots on this map, you can find this on our website. These are the different communities in which Annalena and myself and our third navigator have protocols or have a response or have a multidisciplinary team in the state. We certainly work in every community in North Dakota, but those are the largest populated communities. So that's where our focus is on the human trafficking teams. And then the stars on the map are where we have had cases of human trafficking in our state, which continues to grow. So just to point out that we do have a large number of people being sex and labor trafficked in the state of North Dakota.
So we're going to start out with some definitions, and the definition of human trafficking, according to Polaris, according to the Justice Department, is that it's an actual recruitment, harboring, transporting, or procurement of a person for labor or services for the purpose of involuntary servitude, forced commercial sex, or slavery.
So with that, we have the two categories that we're focusing on today, sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And with the labor trafficking piece, it's places of employment where people come typically from out of this country, who come here legally and are exploited through work. They're forced to work against their will. They're not able to call their family as they'd like. They aren't given their paychecks regularly or at all. They're not given proper healthcare needs, or basic needs are not being met. So they're being exploited through having to work long hours, long days, and not getting basic needs met, emotional needs met. And oftentimes there is abuse as well, whether physical, emotional, or sexual abuse as well with labor trafficking. With sex trafficking, we see a lot of survival sex, which we'll talk about today within our communities, what looks like normal, quote unquote, prostitution, where people aren't actually willing participants, although it looks as though they are. We see this happen in the pornography industry, within strip clubs, within hotels, motels, and we see children being exploited in our state. We'll talk further about that as we go. Mail order brides is something as well that could potentially fall under the sex trafficking category. So like these definitions here, the difference really is labor trafficking is a form of slavery in which individuals perform labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion. With sex trafficking, simply the difference is they perform commercial sex through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Commercial meaning something of value being exchanged. So when you see the word commercial, it's an agreed upon exchange of something that those individuals are finding valuable. It could be money, but it certainly could be drugs, a place to stay, groceries, free rent, anything that's agreed upon that has value to those individuals.
Yep. And we've seen some crazy stuff. We've seen, I want to have a really cool birthday party, so I'll exchange sex for that. And it's not always as pretty as you may think it is, because it puts people in a compromising position. What I want you to understand also, when Melissa and I are telling the state and when we train nationally, is that this is a crime. This is a public health concern as well, because it is an agrarious situation where we see people being exploited against their will. And every community throughout the United States, throughout North Dakota, across any age or gender, it doesn't discriminate at all.
So a concern with sexual exploitation is what happens to anyone who is sold, traded, or objectified for sex in exchange, again, for something of value. And so we'll talk more about the difference between sexual exploitation or labor exploitation and human trafficking. But typically in a criminal case of human trafficking, when you're looking at that force, fraud, or coercion, you need a third party involvement or a third party benefit. So someone could be exploited by somebody else, which only takes two people. One person can exploit or take advantage of the other. Typically, the difference with human trafficking is there's a third party that's organizing the exchange of sex or labor, or that's benefiting by getting something of value within that exchange. So we'll talk more about examples as we go. I would say typically we would see a trafficker would organize the exchange of sex between a child and another adult, maybe for free rent. So if you can see that trafficker then gets the free rent, they're the third person that's involved that benefits, but they're not having to exchange the sex over here with somebody else in order to get that benefit. So there's that third party involved.
And this kind of puts it all together for you, right? So if you didn't like all that verbiage, this diagram right here kind of explains it. When it's somebody under the age of 18, though, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. We don't always have to have the means perspective, right? Because as we know, children, young adults can't consent, right? Under the age of 18, can't consent. So we don't need to always choose means, but with an adult, that piece is super important. And that's where it gets frustrating for some, especially for prosecution and law enforcement, finding that probable cause. Mm-hmm. Did I hit that? Okay.
Yeah. How do you prove coercion, right? And so that's where we get frustrated sometimes with these cases is we might know or take our client's word for what happened to them, but how do we prove that they were coerced or forced into doing something in order for it to be prosecuted? And oftentimes our victims don't want prosecutions out of fear of what will happen to them, or the stigma or shame attached to being a victim in that victim blaming culture that we live in. And so there's a lot of reasons they don't want to even come forward, even when we have proof of the force, fraud, or coercion. And like Anna-Lena said, with youth, we don't even need that. It's just they are a victim because they're under the age of 18, and we're automatically providing them victim supportive services because of that.
Correct. Which leads us into commercial sexual exploitation of children. And I know we're gonna be talking about children and throughout this presentation as well. And in the second presentation, it's often not always identified, because it looks differently. It looks like sexual abuse. It looks like neglect. You see runaway kids who are using drugs and acting, quote, inappropriately. So we have to, what we're doing now is flipping the narrative and classifying as it is. It's human trafficking, it's child sexual abuse material, which is the pornography. Pornography kind of glamorizes that. So we're trying to train people to say it's child sexual abuse material. So in healthcare, it's tough because we're not always thinking trafficking, but we need to keep it in the back of our minds.
Yeah, no, I think Annalena brings up some great points. And with that, understanding or flipping that mindset too, to say this isn't a choice. I mean, they're going to present to us oftentimes as it is a choice, or that they want this lifestyle because that is where they're at, right? That is where they're at in their mental health, in their trauma, and in their ability to even leave the situation, which we'll dig into more as we go. So understanding that youth, for one, even if they say they consent to this, they can't. And so that's why we want to look at them as victims. And thinking about, as an adult or a child, you know, who would want to have sex with multiple strangers every day? When we talk specifically about sex trafficking, who would ask for that to happen to them? One example we use is, let's say you are sitting at the front door of Walmart and you have to have sex with the next 10 people that walk through that door. And it doesn't matter their gender. It doesn't matter if they're violent with you. It doesn't matter if they have fetishes that you're not into. You have to have sex with those 10 people today. And typically they don't get the money from that exchange of sex. And so when we break down what prostitution really looks like in this choice, people are not choosing that for themselves when they have other options or supports, or don't fear for their life. And with labor trafficking, our victims are coming to the United States legally. So again, kind of breaking down that stereotype of they're coming over here by illegal means, and that's not the case. They come here legally, and traffickers are holding them against their will. They're holding their identifying documents. They don't know the culture or the language or the laws here, and our traffickers are exploiting that.
Yeah, we have to have a wider lens. The trauma is extremely complex. Yes, we all know about domestic violence. We know intimate partner violence and the sexual assault and trauma. But what we see now is a huge, when you see a lot of sexually transmitted diseases, infections, or reproductive trauma, there are traffickers who will require some of our clients for quality control, to have a hysterectomy without their will or consent. Many of these individuals see themselves as criminals. So that mindset, when they come into the emergency room or into a clinic, it's not that I'm a victim. It's, hey, fix me, make me good because I'm a product and I suck, basically, for lack of a better term. So they're not gonna, the goal isn't disclosure. The goal is get me fixed, because if not, it's a matter of life or death for me. And we may interpret that completely different. So their behavior is going to be different. The way they present, you're going to possibly brush them off, which is not on a slight on any of us in healthcare. It's just they don't present like we would think, like in the movies, right?
Yeah, and I would say to Annalena's point, one thing we'll dig into as we go is that concept of safety. And can you go back to the other one?
Sure.
I want to mention something with the medical. When we have to ask them, do they feel safe at home? And looking at the trauma and understanding the complexity of it, it's different than any other client I've worked with. And I'm sure for Annalena could say the same as far as patients. And so that piece of, we get them in and out and on to the next, you know, thinking about when we ask someone if they're safe, who is sitting next to them in that space, right? Thinking about that. And the services that we offer aren't always human trafficking specific. And with a different complexity in the trauma, we aren't seeing that we have treatment or housing or shelter or what have you, mental health specific to trafficking. And so that's what the task force is here for, is to try to mend what we can together for these clients. That's why we need a team approach and understand that it's not consistent with behavior. Sometimes it's, the behavior is specific to the trauma. It's not necessarily these psychiatric issues they were born with or had. It's something that's happened to them as they've gone through life.
So while we're talking, think psychological trauma, and just keep that in the back of your mind when we look at how the actual exploitation and trafficking occurs. Needs aren't being met. Something's going on in people's lives, okay? And maybe they're vulnerable. I love this diagram because it really hits home in all the work that we do. Somebody knows how to take advantage of that. And then they said, hey, baby, I'll take care of you. You know, you're not getting what you need at home, or I'll take, you know, it's all these Romeo false promises that we hear. And then that's what leads to the exploitation and trafficking, because everything that they need is being provided by a certain individual or individuals. And then when they get far into it, they realize, crap, this is bad. And then they can't get out because they've had to commit a crime, or they feel like they're just a body or a vessel. And then there's video out there, and it just gets more and more complex for them to even think about themselves as a victim, right?
Absolutely.
So Melissa will tell you that, and she was just talking about how they present, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That prostitution piece. And we hear this, unfortunately, there's bad apples in all of our helping professions, whether medical, social work, law enforcement. When we work with victims, oftentimes there was opportunities for our professions to help or to respond to them in a non-judgmental, helpful, respectful manner. And we miss the mark on that. We might be having a bad day. We might be burnt out. We might have seen them for the third time this week. And so they present to us like they are prostituting themselves. They present to us as homeless populations, like they have mental health or drug addiction. We see a lot of them that live under the poverty line, which adds to that unmet need or that vulnerability that gets them trafficked. We see a lot of them that are involved in the criminal system with theft, fraud, those types of things, as that's how they make ends meet when they're in the life. And then that sexual assault, that domestic violence is how they present often as well. So we look at these needs as how they're presenting and what we're treating. But oftentimes what we miss from this list is that human trafficking piece, that this can exist within all of these things that we're treating them for, but it's also its own category of why someone might be presenting to us. So thinking about that too, if you are working with someone who has all of these needs or presents with these vulnerabilities, that's something that a trafficker is going to recruit based on, or something that you can say, okay, they have A, B, and C up from this list. They're either vulnerable to trafficking, or maybe there's trafficking here and I need to look into that further.
Which leads us into the vulnerable piece. And again, we don't want you to be with a patient or have a client in the clinic and be like, they're trafficked, right? Anybody is vulnerable to being trafficked or exploited. Think about intimate partner violence, think about domestic violence, think about teen dating victimization. So it's some of these individuals have a strong need for something, and they may not have the coping skills. And we'll talk about ACEs and childhood events that affect that. But if you look at some of these vulnerabilities, it just should require you to ask another question, peel back that layer, that onion, to see, asking open-ended questions, all the things that we learned in medical school and nursing school and wherever our practices that leads us to. These are things, these open-ended questions are important for us to ask.
And I would say too, the social worker in me always has to mention, at the core of being a human being, we all want to feel loved and needed. And so we oftentimes get confused about why would they go back or put themselves in this situation when they need love or romance, because we all do as human beings. And we will sacrifice our safety, our basic needs to feel loved and needed and belonged. And oftentimes these victims start out as youth, right? So you think of that vulnerability, that need to be loved even more so, that doesn't go away when they turn the age of 18, right? So they're needing this feeling of wanted and love when maybe they're trafficked as a child, and that continues on into adulthood because they don't have the skills to get a job, right? To find support systems because they've already been traumatized. They've already experienced that need for love and that dependence on somebody for that.
So you take this one because
Sure.
I know you like this one.
I do like this one.
Yeah.
So when we talk about specifically for sex trafficking, who is involved in the exchange of a human? So you have the trafficker. So you all might see some of these traffickers prevent in a medical setting. One thing Annalena can talk to more later, but we will often say, blame your policy. If you're concerned and you don't want a trafficker to go back with somebody, or you're seeing a really controlling relationship that might be domestic violence and not necessarily trafficking, sometimes we say, just say, based on our policy, we have to talk to this individual by ourselves, right? So do something like that to separate the two. So the trafficker might be a Romeo pimp. That's going to be your trafficker who glamorizes love and a future, right, with somebody where they are their boyfriend or girlfriend. So they are charming, they're charismatic. You're probably even going to like them sometimes. They're very good at what they do. And so that Romeo pimp is someone that wants you to fall in love with them. They're going to spoil you a lot. We certainly see familial pimping in our state, family members trafficking one another. So again, it's that homegrown, they're born into that lifestyle. We see a rescuer, so kind of filling that void of maybe a parent or a helper. So maybe they start picking someone up after school every day and bumming them a cigarette. Maybe they give you a place to stay when your parents kicked you out. Maybe they gave you a job that you needed when you were an adult and had 2 kids at home and needed some help, right? So they rescued you out of a situation. So later you feel this need to owe them, or they start asking things of you in return at a later time, that part of that grooming recruitment. Sack pimping is just someone who is drug trafficking as well as human trafficking. We see gangs and drugs go hand in hand with human trafficking. It's hard to find one without the other in some dynamic or component. A sex buyer, they're going to be the person that's purchasing sex, and we have a huge market for that in our state. So you might hear terms like trick, date, John. They're the perpetrator, they're the offender, right? They're the ones breaking the law by purchasing sex from an adult or a child. And then the victim offender, or the term, the slang term is bottom bitch. And that's the individual who is working now for the trafficker for a variety of reasons. Maybe they've been with their trafficker the longest. They've probably endured the most amount of trauma or abuse from that trafficker. But now they've kind of gone across this line on being an offender themselves along with the trafficker, because there's some benefit to that, to being more loved or given more attention to by that trafficker. And so they're still a victim. They deserve our treatment and our care and our help. However, they've also crossed this line into offending at this point. So they're helping the trafficker maybe recruit victims or organize the exchange of sex. So we see these individuals involved in the sale of a human on the sex trafficking side. In the labor trafficking side, we still have a trafficker. They're typically in our state going to be maybe a massage parlor owner. They're going to be a farmer, someone in agriculture. Maybe they run a construction site where they're the ones exploiting that individual for their labor. And then we have people that help get them from their country to our country that are on it in some capacity. They're organizing the individual who thinks they're going to have a great work or school opportunity to come here. And then they're getting money in that exchange of that individual coming from their country here under the impression they're going to have a great opportunity. So again, that coercion involved there. And then again, we see multiple victims oftentimes on these construction sites and these massage parlors. So there's multiple victims in one setting together.
And what I'm going to surprise you all is that we also, from a healthcare perspective, sometimes we see this in our nursing homes, in our private duty nurses. We see the labor trafficking piece as well. So again, think about it. Foreign-born individuals are so vulnerable because they want a better life. And I'm from Panama. I'm Cuban and Panamanian, and this is a wonderful country. And so when people say, well, this is better than the country that you were at, it's still a public health concern. It's still an egregious crime, even though life is better here in the United States than where they're from. It's still, you should not be exploiting somebody for the benefit of you. So that leads us into where recruitment happens, which is pretty much anywhere and everywhere. So this list, certainly the tip of the iceberg, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
I mean, and so it's everywhere. It's not as obvious. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, but it's not as obvious. And so when we look at the reality in our world, traffickers, remember we mentioned I mentioned the emotional coercion. It's not about the sex, it's about the control, right? So how they do it is by terrorizing people, by starving them. Protein deprivation is a big one for all of my medical people, and sleep deprivation. What else? The unexpected sexual violence, just because, like Melissa used that scenario in Walmart, you have to have sex with the next 10 people that come in. It's not your choice. It could be a smelly person. It could be a whatever person. It could be a person with an STD, because not always do they use a condom. So, and they learn to be helpless. And that's a weird concept. They learn to depend. Well, you've always been there. You've always taken care of me. I can't do this alone. So that's why this is the lifestyle. And this, because there are good days and then there's bad days. It's just, again, that vicious cycle of exploitation and love and control and terror.
Well, and that learned helplessness piece, for an example, one of our colleagues had a client and she didn't even know what music on the station to listen to when they were driving somewhere together, because that part of her had been controlled. They are learned to be dependent on someone else for everything that they don't even know how to think for themselves. So imagine trying to leave somebody when you don't even know how to make a decision for yourself about the music we listen to. And as a social worker, there was a learned helplessness study we discussed in school, and this really helped me understand the why don't sex and labor trafficking victims leave. And they did a study with dogs where when they put dogs in kennels, the dogs would get shocked, anytime they moved to sides of the kennel. And so after so much time, when they opened the door and the dogs could see that they could leave, none of them left their cage. And so the goal of that was to say they learned that helplessness of you can try, you can fight, you can want to, get out of a situation. But after so much time of being shot down again and again, or not having an out, even when you see one, you've learned to be helpless. You've learned to depend on somebody or be trauma bonded to them, where you don't leave anymore because of that helplessness that you've, I guess, been accustomed to at that point.
Absolutely. And I met with a client, you just made me think about yesterday. They wanted me to do a medical assessment and also an interview for services. And the one question this young girl said to me, she's like, I don't know why. I think I might go back to him. And that right there. And I said, sweetheart, that's trauma bonding. And we kind of unpacked that basically and talked about what is the perception? What are you thinking that could happen when you are out there in the world, or what they say, square up, okay, and start doing what, living differently than what you're accustomed to? What is the threat? And her big thing was like, he might just say the right thing. He might bring up a memory. He might give me the drugs I used to use, so I'll relapse. And we all know relapse is part of recovery. And then he knows my family. And what if what if there were a lot of what ifs? And in one session, we couldn't unpack that. And so the perception and the memory. And then she said, if I go out there, there's many of our clients that she and I share mutually. It says, if I go out there, I'm dead. If I don't go back to him, I could possibly be dead. So again, this relationship is tough. And it's the hardest one to put into words, especially to a survivor or victim of trafficking. And for us to sit back in Monday night quarterback and it's like, why are they going back? Why?
Well, and ultimately, my mindset around it is it doesn't matter. What matters is we're here to help them when they come to our agencies and our organizations for assistance. And so what is important to understand is this concept of trauma bonding, also known as like Stockholm syndrome, if you're familiar with that term and that experience for individuals in that situation. So I love the definition on the first bullet: the presence of a perceived threat to one's physical or psychological survival and the belief that the abuser would carry out the threat. So it's this, well, another example our colleague has used, which was really helpful, is let's say you're on an island, a deserted island, and you don't eat meat and you haven't eaten for a week, and someone comes up to you and says, I have food for you. You can have chicken or beef. And if you're starving on an island, those aren't choices that you want, but you're probably going to choose one. And so thinking about that with trauma bonding too, if there's a perceived threat or a threat against you or your pets or your family or your reputation, all of these things, what are you going to choose when you're put in those types of situations? And so typically they're bonded with this trafficker through the trauma that they endure with their trafficker. And again, thinking of that learned helplessness piece along with this. And it's this presence of a perceived small kindness from the abuser to the victim, similar to what Anna-Lena was just saying about clients. And what I see it as is they wait for that one compliment. And when they know that tomorrow my trafficker is going to love me, right? They're going to tell me they love me. They're going to wine and dine me. They're going to be nice to me. So on really bad days, it's like, well, tomorrow will be better, right? Today is really hard, but tomorrow they're going to love me. Tomorrow I'm going to get my needs met. And so it's this ongoing roller coaster that they know even when it's bad, it's going to get good again. So they're still bonded through their trauma with that trafficker. And they're isolated. Oftentimes too, our victims move in with trafficker or they move to another area. So they're again, more dependent on trafficker. They may not have their own supports there through family, friends, or local shelters or help. So they're isolated and hear only that perspective of the trafficker. They don't feel like they can escape the situation. And so when we're interacting with victims, it absolutely impacts our relationship with them. And it's all about planting that seed. Are we going to get them to leave the first time we connect with them? the chances are very low. But if we plant that seed to know we care about you, we don't want this for you, we're not judging you for decisions you've made, they're going to remember that. And our clients do remember that. And they'll tell us stories about years ago they met with some type of provider who cared about them, and they don't forget about that. And so those interactions are so important, because after a while, this trauma bond for a lot of victims, they get to a point of being fearful, but still wanting to leave and get to a point of leaving. And so they're going to find us at that time and try to make a plan. And they might relapse time and time again, but we want to be there for them when that happens.
Yep. So then all this, we've given you definitions, we've given you the law, we've given you force, fraud, coercion, not force, all these things. But what is this telling us? It's telling us three things. Right now, you're listening to us, you're getting that education, right? You're understanding that it's out there. It's the patients that are unseen is the best way for me to describe it. And I keep that in the back of my mind. When Melissa said that there are providers who have been very positive, there are very few of them. Many of our victims will tell you, I came in at the age of 7, I had an exam and I had an STD, and not the nurse nor the doctor did something. And I keep that person who is now in her late 30s and 40s in the back of my mind or in my pocket, my lab coat pocket, saying, I need to make sure I sit down now. And I know we can't do that sometimes, but I always try to say, hey, you know what, whatever's going on, you are worth more. And I'm here and I work night shift, or I'm here, Monday through Friday, leaving that door open. And we have to look at this approach from a team perspective. So our radiologists, our ultrasound tech, our OB nurse, our pre-op, post-op, everybody needs to kind of talk about this as well. So North Dakota numbers, some of you like statistics. So Melissa and I put some slides together and we'll kind of go through them quick.
Sure. Yeah. So again, this surprises people that majority of our clients, 71% of them are adults. And so again, to remember that of these 71% adults, most of them were trafficked as children. So I find this culture interesting when we see like human trafficking of children on TV, whether sex or labor trafficking. We have this empathy for that, right? We want to do something, as we should. However, once they become adults, we're like, oh, they're drug addicts, they're just homeless, they're prostitutes. And so remembering those are the same kids that we cared about when they were children, that just, again, don't have those supports or those life skills to take with them into adulthood. Therefore, they're continually trafficked or put in those situations. So those of our programs working with clients, mostly are adults, 71%. And then what we see right now is 84% of our clients are sex trafficked, 6% are labor trafficked, 9% are both, and 1% is unknown. So there's a few things to point out with this one. Sex trafficking is more visible. When you think about labor trafficking, they are trafficked in places of legal employment. It's these massage parlors, it's construction sites, it's agriculture where we don't have eyes on it, right? So they're out in the middle of nowhere doing agricultural or construction work. We don't necessarily see them every day, and it looks legal on the outside. And so sex trafficking, we're seeing a lot more individuals come to us for services, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, if they run into our law enforcement partners. Labor trafficking stay more under the radar, and they're terrified to come forward for same and different reasons as sex trafficking. But part of it is that deportation fear that traffickers instill in them, that they'll be deported if they don't listen or do A, B, and C.
Yeah. And again, this is data from 2016. So what happened before that? Data is only good as what's reported. Melissa and I always think that's why we're here today. There's more than this. There's much more than this. But we wanted to, at least when we look at the numbers, she and I are both like, wow, our work is there's a lot still to go with. And then our survivors, it's really neat to have them come back and talk to us about what they experienced. And these are just some racial demographics. I am Hispanic, proud of it. And it's sad to see that we're part of that statistic as well. And so it's interesting. And I bet in the next, 3 to 4 years, the pie will get bigger, the slices will get larger. And again, this is brand new data as of up until June 30th of this year.
And not surprising, we see almost half being individuals who are white when you look at the demographics and makeup of our state. But to Anna Lena's point, these numbers are the tip of the iceberg, because these numbers come from programs that are within or subgrantees of the Human Trafficking Task Force. And so there are various other agencies, such as those of you watching this video, your medical providers, that might have worked with a victim of trafficking, but you didn't necessarily plug that into our data system. So there's pieces of it that are really helpful tools, but we know that there's a lot more there, to Anna Lena's point, especially with Native Americans as well. On this graph, there are, what was it again?
24%.
Up to 24. Yeah, so 24% are Native Americans that work with our program, but we all know that there's tons more trafficked natives in our state just because of the makeup of the reservations. And there's a lot more familial pimping on reservations in our state as well, that kind of word of mouth, that family homegrown piece that we don't necessarily ever work with them or see them.
And again, there's an ICD-10 code that's about psychological coercion and there's a mental piece. And I challenge you to look for that. It's in the 500s because our foreign-born individuals are afraid. And that mental piece, when you talk to many of them, will tell you, I was too scared to say anything. And who will listen to me because I don't speak the language? I have a family to provide. I've got a deadline. So I'll do what I need to do because I can get work here, whereas I can't get it in El Salvador and I can't get it in Ethiopia or wherever they're from. So when we look at that, I suspect these numbers are much different if people felt safe. And you'll find out many of these people are people you're coming in contact with daily. The settings is my favorite slide. This is statewide. It's interesting when we break it from the west to the east, but most of it happens in hotel, motels, and private homes. And why is that? And if you were here and we could talk, we would tell you that it's quiet, it's silent, it's behind the scenes. It's not as obvious. And so this is one of my favorite slides that I always ask for because it's where it's not often seen. It's kept private. So when we also look at the referrals that we've received, this is all because of training. Literally, I think.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
Our largest portion is from local government agencies. When I look at my victim service providers, they're right there as well. The one I want to work on is our mental health and also our hospital settings. We need to do a better job. We honestly do. And this is the first step. And we appreciate having this opportunity.
In my experience too, working with sex and labor trafficking victims, the few labor trafficking victims I've worked with, a lot of that comes from medical providers because they are going in to you all voluntarily, and medical providers are picking up on the fact that maybe they're labor trafficked or there's something going on, and then they've contacted us. So that's really great. And again, that voluntary piece, human trafficking victims are sometimes scared of us as social workers, as law enforcement, as prosecutors, but when they go to you voluntarily looking for help, oftentimes if they are going to disclose, medical provider is someone safe that they have a better chance of doing so with. And so Anna Lena will talk more about that over this session and the next one as well, but keeping that in mind as we go.
The best, if you're going to remember anything, look at this slide, okay? 88% of victims of human trafficking, labor, and sex seek medical treatment. And there's a study done by Baldwin and Chang. It's called Identification of Victims. It's in the resources. Survivors will tell you that this is truly, they went and did a longitudinal study on survivors, and they said they came to a medical facility at some point during their trafficking experience. And the most common agency that they went to was dental and ER. So when you look at the dentist, when you look at the emergency department, this is where they come. Unfortunately, only about 10% of our physicians recognize human trafficking, and a mere 3% of our ER physicians feel that they are trained. And when I query that, when I go out in the West, they'll say, I don't know what I'm doing, or I think it may be and we may not. And the reason is that there is no best practices in human trafficking. It's still really new, even though it's been going on for centuries. We pull best practices from domestic violence, from sexual assault, from our different organizations. And it's imperative of healthcare professionals, when you look at this graph, and I love it that Melissa found this on her own, is that, you know, we need to do a better job at least identifying or establishing that rapport so that we can identify or provide that trauma-informed piece that we need to have. I'll let you.
Sure. So when you talk about the health consequences of being trafficked, there's a wide range of unique situations, and we'll go through that with some of our indicators, but just understanding that you are going to see a lot of health issues. So what gets tricky sometimes is people say, well, they have A, B, and C, that means they must be trafficked. And certainly we don't want people to come away with that. Again, just thinking about that list in the beginning, it's just another component to add as a possibility of what is going on, to keep in the back of our mind, to know the resources and to be able to ask questions. And as you'll learn in part 2, we wouldn't necessarily say, we think you're a victim of human trafficking, because we don't even know what that means, right? And so to claim someone or call them a victim or labeling them something like that can be really scary or overwhelming or confusing, or frankly, make them really upset. And so thinking about how we ask questions to them and just saying, you know, we're concerned about you, right? We want to make sure you're safe. You know, there's different things that we're seeing, and you can point out the things you're seeing. I want to connect you with someone, you know, are you open to that? And I had a client once who was being trafficked. She was from another country and was married and over here. And she came into the appointment on her own. She didn't speak English. And the provider called me and said, you know, what can we do? And we ended up setting up another appointment for her to come back, and said, you know, he couldn't be there. And then in the meantime, I coordinated a translator to be on the phone, and we were able to talk with that medical provider, the translator, and that individual to get them the help that they needed more discreetly. Just because a medical provider sat down with someone and said, you know, there's something going on. Are you okay? Can we help you? And from there, we were able to provide her services discreetly. And again, people that have specific disabilities are also more vulnerable to trafficking. So thinking about that as well. And a lot of individuals with disabilities use our bus systems in town. And so traffickers often recruit and groom outside of medical facilities, such as our homeless health, our public health, because they know people go in there who typically fall under the poverty line, they have disabilities, and then they might be using the bus to get to and from. And so that's places that they recruit and groom as well.
Yeah. And, you know, we saw statistics, right? Not everybody's equipped to handle everything, right? My background is ICU and ER and burns and trauma. I was a flight nurse for most of my career, been a nurse for over 30 years and love it and still do it. And now I do more of the forensic piece. The thing that we have to understand is that the pattern, the behavior, all those things that we've talked about. Do you remember when you first went into medical school, when you first got into healthcare, when you first got into nursing, we took an oath, right? And it was all about, we wanted to heal, or we wanted to take care of someone. And I know statistics and getting people in and out and all that's changed. Believe you me, I understand that tremendously with billing and all that, but we need to go back to basics. Many of you will understand what I'm saying. We need to bring quality back to bedside. And that means sitting down and just talking, taking that extra 2 minutes, because in our experience, and me being now in the back seat and seeing it from when I was an ER nurse and when I did all the stuff that I do and do now, I can see many of the people I missed. This work is all about trauma. And it's not the trauma of missing an arm, missing an eye. I can do that. That's awesome. I can find something in this room to open an airway. But people who have been traumatized mentally present differently, and their behaviors is their survival. It's how they survive. So peeling that back, asking the question, hey, what's going on? It's 3 a.m. because none of these people come in during the day, you know, it's 3 a.m. and you've been here 9 times for a UTI, for a urinary tract infection. What's going on? That's all you have to say. They may not say anything, but the fact that you took that extra minute or minute and a half will make a huge difference later on.
Absolutely.
Huge difference.
And knowing that people respond to trauma differently. You might have someone who's very rigid, who is terrified for you to even do a check on them. And you might have someone who has zero boundaries and, you know, are treating you differently. People with trauma don't always treat us very well because of their fear, what they've been taught, maybe previous experiences, maybe they are coming off of drugs. And so understanding that every single person with trauma is going to present differently. And one thing I see with people in our professions is they often compare how they would be to that person. Like, well, I had a crummy childhood and I didn't do that. I didn't turn out that way. And just to understand we are all different, and the way that we can process trauma and deal with our trauma and the way that affects our behaviors and our mental health is going to be different with every single person. And so treating everybody the same, understanding that trauma piece if you have not had any of that training. So too, with these individuals, oftentimes as children, they were chronic runaways. That's what we see a lot. What we would call throwaway kids. We hate that term, but basically, let's say a child is kicked out of the home, but a parent doesn't report them missing and social services isn't involved. They're just kind of out there. So thinking of that vulnerability, that need to, that want to be loved, right? And so thinking about how much more vulnerable they are when they are these throwaway kids that no one really cares about or knows where they are. And then that minimal parental involvement is going to have brain development issues, right? We're going to see neglect of the brain. I used to work in treatment foster care, and almost every little child I worked with had neglect within their chart, right? Because of, we know how that affects their development going forward. They have a history of abuse, certainly, as well as when we work with adults. They need money, as we've talked about. They oftentimes self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, even if for those that are female, are pregnant, right? So they're going to be self-medicating, again, thinking about being exploited all day, every day. Oftentimes there's going to be that self-medication piece, and it's their traffickers typically who get them addicted to drugs, or might even be the one to introduce them to drugs or give them their drugs free. So there's that additional dependence or need for their trafficker on top of that. So thinking about that into as children, how is that going to impact them into adulthood and how that they present to us when we're trying to work with them?
Right. And so, you know, as a forensic nurse, I always tell people my office is south of the navel, right? And so it takes time to work south of the navel, right? And so that's the opportunity I take when I'm doing the exam, a gynecological exam, is that if I see injury or if I see something that just isn't right, or just for casual culture, hey, tell me about your life. How was your life? Where did you come from? Strike up that conversation. It may extend the exam a little longer, but again, you're taking time to make them feel more human, because as I said over and over again, the impact of trauma that they've had in childhood, you may be taking care of a 30-year-old, 40-year-old who has the mentality of maybe a 4-year-old, a 15-year-old, an 18-year-old, or even a 20-year-old. And time again, some of the nurses that I've spoken to will be like, huh, you know, just the aha moment, because the foundation that many of us had as children may not have been the same for someone else who experienced trauma, who witnessed violence. All that has some sort of experience. And we've talked about how the vulnerabilities, the disabilities, someone who knows that, or if, let's say you share on Instagram or Facebook Messenger that, hey, my life is kind of crappy, I didn't have a good home life, that power that an offender, I'm going to call him an offender, okay, not a pimp, I'm going to say offender, the person who is taking advantage or exploiting the human, okay, adult or child, uses this to also to recruit and to trap them into this lifestyle, the life. And again, there's an ICD-10 code that really brings us into play as well.
I would say too, you guys can Google search this. It's an excellent tool to utilize. And there's also a sex and labor trafficking power and control wheel as well. There's domestic violence, there's LGBTQIA+ power and control wheels. So have these as tools and resources to use. I would say too, what this helps understand is it's not always what we think it's going to present as. Females can be pimps, males can be victims. And so switching that too, because oftentimes what we do is automatically think a trafficker is a male and a victim is a female. We absolutely see male victims of sex and labor trafficking, and we absolutely see female traffickers. And I had a medical provider call me once and said, hey, I think we missed something. 2 females came in together and we allowed them to go into the appointment together. And we realized how controlling one was over the other in answering questions and, you know, how she's getting her medical care. And based on the situation, it felt like she was trafficking her potentially. So we missed that. We missed the separation point because there were 2 females together and we didn't keep that in mind. And we'd see the same with males too, where males aren't always looked at as victims or potential victims. And so using these wheels and understanding that there's no specific dynamic for how that relationship looks.
Yeah. And sometimes don't beat yourself up. You may miss it. you may just miss it. But if you have a positive intervention, a positive interaction, trust me, they'll come back. Chisholm Stock Straker is a great resource for any of you who like to read journals of medicine and the Journal of Healthcare for Poor and Underserved. This is a 2016 study where, and I had read this when I started doing this work, and I was like, And when I was actually in a forensic exam at 2:30 in the morning, somebody in the ER said, this person's presenting with a urinary tract infection. She showed up with Louis Vuitton bags. She's kind of, shaky. She's just, there's something wrong. And that nurse of 30 some years of experience said, I called you because I thought you have time to meet with her because I don't have time. And so I came in with our team of law enforcement and myself, and we asked questions, and she disclosed that her trafficker was waiting for her outside the emergency room and that she was afraid and she just had enough and I said, when was the last time you ate something? Are you cold? Would you like a blanket? And she said, after many years now, there was a federal case on this now. And she said, you asking me if I needed anything made me want to tell you what was going on. And I use that example when I train, and I keep that in the back of my mind, even when I'm practicing, that I need to take that extra time because she was not feeling well, and her trafficker used that and said, you better go in, get your meds and come out, and I'm timing you. And she was like, oh my God. And somebody offered her a meal and something very simple. And she said, I feel safe here. And that's the big thing, is that we need to understand that sometimes some of these regular things like a urinary tract infection, or I think I might be pregnant, or testing for an STI, for a sexually transmitted infection or disease, they're going through stuff in their life that they're looked as product. And so product is good, right? You want your shoes to last forever. You want your human that is your vessel for money to last a long time too. So certain kinds of victims that come in, or patients or clients that come in for certain ailments, should just kind of make you pause and ask a couple more questions, right? Because that's the big thing they do, is they use healthcare as controls. Like, you want to feel good, you better serve me and do what you need to do, and then I'll get you to the doctor. Same thing with labor trafficking. You finish working, and then I'll get you to the doctor's office to fix your teeth or to do whatever. Is that good?
Yeah.
Yep. So everyone's always asking Melissa and I need an indicator. I need a screening tool. I need this, I need that. So we're going to tell you, we don't have that bullet. We don't have the perfect answer, but we can give you some potential things to look for.
Yeah, I think when it comes to indicators, again, these are individuals that you all work with every day. So oftentimes people say, we don't know how to talk to them, we don't know how to work with them. And you do. It's people that you interact with every day. It's just sometimes you don't have that lens of trafficking. It's more about knowing the resources again, and knowing how to make them feel like they're in a non-judgmental, safe environment. And so if they have unusual reactions to their exams, and Annalena can certainly chime in on some of this, but oftentimes, again, you might feel that they're really rigid or really scared or really uncomfortable, but more fear and paranoia maybe than you're used to seeing with some people that just are uncomfortable in those appointments. And especially with the disrobing to an office, it's really helpful to let them know the entire process, how long it's going to take. If you can talk to them at first with their clothing on, of course, is which happens, but just to talk about how long the process is, what the point is, when their results come back. So giving them all of that information really thoroughly. They might have sexualized behavior. So again, they don't really have boundaries, because thinking about if they were trafficked as children, they might be very sexualized. They don't always know how to interact with people when it's not in a sexualized manner. And so understanding, you might see the complete opposite of them being more sexualized. They might be really flinchy, very tense in those appointments. Of course, they don't respond. Sometimes we see just a very flat affect in our clients. They've just kind of learned to not emote or to not react, because that gets them in trouble. And so they in turn become numb. And so they're very flat oftentimes. they can be very confused. They might have a hard time focusing. They might not know why they're there. So a lot of that might be that trauma, or they're coming off of drugs. There's a lot of reasons why they might come off as very confused or distracted. And like Annalena said, it could be because their trafficker has given them a timeline, right, of being in and out, or maybe their trafficker doesn't know that they're even there. And so they do feel very confused or distracted in those moments, or maybe impatient.
I think the big one for me was that I see quite a bit when I'm doing exams or assessments is that they're hyperventilating, or they defecate on themselves, or need to go to the bathroom. But the big one that I see a lot, and I'm not saying that's a main indicator, is they'll go limp, totally limp. And that for me is like, that's a big one. Same with children. When they open their legs, when I put them in a frog style, or I put them in a certain position, then they'll just like, and I'm like, this is not right. This is not right. Again, unusual things is what we want you to look at, which require a little bit more of attention.
I was just going to add to that too, thinking about your stress hormone response system too. And oftentimes you might get migraines, you might have, eye injury and strains, you might get stomach aches because of abuse. But thinking about the stress and how we all have that when I get stressed, I get a tight stomach and I get a migraine without question. And so thinking about sometimes your clients are going to have those same situations about why are they so stressed? Why do they have these stomach complaints and these migraines and these eye issues? It might be that connection to the stress that they endure with the trauma.
Right. And again, these are many of the other indicators that are kind of obvious. I just want you to kind of look at the list. I have not seen branding. I've seen some burns. I've seen some different kinds of tattoos, but I've got tattoos too, so I don't pay them too much mind. But what I do have noticed, and when I go into the women's prison, and they're the best teachers for me, is some of the tattooing is happening under their hairline, or in their hair. So some of my clients have told me, yeah, when you're doing an exam, look at the hair, look at the scalp. And I'm like, never thought about that. You do see some obvious ones. You see those. If you Google, you'll see tons of different kinds of branding tattoo, but I don't see those. Many of my clients always say, I think I've been chipped. And if somebody says that I think I've been chipped, don't go to the dark side. But go to the middle side is what I say, and kind of investigate that and be like, all right, what makes you feel that you've been chipped? What put you in that position to be chipped? Because I feel that because it's that whole like hypervigilance, the scared thing. And then the controlling thing, the example that Melissa said, somebody present there. But with foreign born individuals, when I first came to this country, I didn't speak English very well. So I always had somebody speaking for me. So don't always think that, again, we all live in the dark side when we're in healthcare, right? Don't always assume the worst, but pause for concern, perhaps like Melissa said, a separation policy, asking a little bit more questions and those kind of things.
Well, and I think with that, one thing you might see more obviously is that, they don't have the things that they need every day. They don't have control over their ID or their cell phone, or like Annalena said too, they have things that they don't have the means to afford. And so kind of those material goods, either not having control over them or having too much of them where it doesn't add up. And then is someone constantly calling them or wanting to be at their appointment. So those things are kind of more obvious ones just to start putting on your radar. Could be domestic violence or something else. However, it's just the start of that being in the back of your mind.
Absolutely. Because the physical signs, and many of you may have already started thinking about clients that you've seen or patients that you've taken care of that had, the physical stuff too. The big one, that I see sometimes is the delayed care, or the need for certain things that are just like, okay, why are you so nervous about your yeast infection, or your follow-up after an abortion that you've had, or something like that? What happened? Again, it's asking those questions that we learned in school, the motivational interviewing, that whole like open-ended questions that I teach the nursing students. We've got to ask those questions, because again, it's that one open door that will lead to that faucet, right? With our patients, they'll tell you more if they can, or they'll come back. These are just some of the physical indicators that we see in labor trafficking, severe workplace injuries, prolonged exposures to pesticides. Again, the physical stuff, and we don't need to go into detail because many of you know that, but exhaustion is a big one. When I see that they're exhausted, I'd be like, so what is your typical day like? And again, you think I have all these really cool conversations with my patients. I kind of do, but I'm like, what's your typical day like? But when was the last time you went and did something for yourself? Like got your nails done? And they're like, what? No, I work 22 hours and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, really? Maybe I need to call somebody. Those are the things with labor trafficking. When I spoke to dentists, I tell dentists, look at the oral maxillar. So look at the upper palate. So when we're doing our exams and we're looking inside, look at denties, the caries, and look at everything and ask them, hey, what happened here? Because again, neglect, long time exposure to things that we normally take care of right away has been delayed for some of these foreign-born individuals who have perhaps could be exploited or something else is going on. And then with sex trafficking, we've kind of talked about all these and given you examples. Anything?
I would just say with the sex trafficking too, it might be that forced piece of forced abortions or those types of things where it might seem like it's against their will that somebody wants that on their behalf for them too.
Right. So some of the environmental indicators, that's all about behavior. I know when you see environmental, you think of like like a chair or something like that. It's all about how are they exhibiting and who may or may not be with them. And don't always assume that the person with them is the bad person. It could be someone else in the same situation. But when we train our front desk people, we just want we actually pay attention to more of the things that we see. Maybe not knowing the medical history, or when you start asking questions, they can't answer those questions as well. Scripted answers we see.
Yeah, scripted answers, unwilling to answer, confused about where they were, what time, where they're at now. Again, that paranoia thing, just not giving a home address, right? They might refuse care and be disrespectful and oppositional. We certainly see that too when they're traumatized and maybe something we say or do triggers them. Or again, if they have to have an exam and they get uncomfortable, we might see those behaviors escalate just because of their history of trauma. Yeah, triggers. So triggers is a tough one. So again, thinking about not taking it personal, but there are things that we might do, say, that just triggers somebody that is not intentional on our part. And so thinking about if they have a lack of power and control. So of course, in our office, when we're doing exams and things of such, they might feel like they have a lack of power and control, or maybe the door's to their back and they can't see what's going on. And so there's that fear of like the not having control in the situation. And again, it might be that we give them a chance to be independent. And we do this with our clients a lot of saying, where would you like to sit? What would you like to drink? So they kind of have some of that ability to gain independence and practice that and know we're going to listen to them. However, that could be triggersome or overwhelming for someone who's not used to making decisions. Unexpected change, that might be something you see too. So that's why I said be very tedious about explaining to them the process and what you're doing with them in your office that day. If they feel threatened or attacked, or if they feel judged, these clients know within a minute if they want to work with us and how we feel about them. They are so hypervigilant and smart about first impressions. And thinking through, again, those first 10 seconds are so crucial to them wanting to even work with us. If they feel vulnerable or frightened, which might happen. So again, feeling like we can give them a space to be safe and comfortable. Sensory is huge. These clients, again, have so many senses going at all times because of their trauma. And you think about what's happened to them. They have a heightened sense of smell. They hear everything going on around them. So you might be wearing a perfume or a cologne that reminds them of a person who purchased them for sex or of their labor trafficker, right? And so that's going to trigger them, and it's not something intentional. And they don't even always know that they're being triggered. It can be a subconscious reaction too that even confuses them about, I'm a bad person. Why am I acting this way? Why am I crazy, right? And so understanding that they can be triggered in a way that confuses them as well. And shame is going to be a very big one. They're going to us for help. And regardless if we've seen them 3 times this week and we don't agree with the choices that they're making, they are there to get help. And that is our role. And so not adding shame or judgment to our interaction with them.
And it's tough. It's tough, trust me, because as I always tell people, people don't get raped or abused or whatever during 9 to 5 when we're awake and all that stuff. These are clients that are going to come either for a scheduled appointment, if it's during the day for an OBGYN, they may come during the day, but many of them come at night because there's less people in the ER, there's less administration, unfortunately. There's less security assistance and all that kind of stuff. The trafficker knows when it's a good time to bring their client in. They really honestly do. And I know that firsthand from a client who told me that. The smells. So we're not saying don't shower, don't take care of yourself. Just if you see a behavior, him like, hey, is there something I'm doing? Again, remember, we learned how to talk to our patients, right? Our clients, right? And we forget that because we've got so many other things to do. Hey, is there something I'm doing that's like, messing you up or making you feel uncomfortable? Again, humanizing it, putting a human perspective to it, to any client who's experienced trauma. Like I survived a plane crash. I've survived stuff in my life. There are certain triggers that set me off, that put me back to that trauma of surviving a plane crash, that when we take off and when we land, I'm like, oh, and I kind of clench down and my sympathetic system, everything starts going into overdrive. And so there are things I have to do to calm down versus going to the dark side and taking a Xanax, right? So being cognizant of that, maybe grounding them again if they are triggered. Hey, are you hungry? Or would you like a warm blanket fixes everything, nurses, we all know that. Are you cold? Is there anything I can get you? Drink of water, ice chips? That will totally bring somebody back, because the body does remember, the mind does remember. That little amygdala that we have, that little walnut in our brain, is a great filing cabinet for memories and trauma.
I would say with that too, with that shame piece, they're going to come in late for injuries or not at all for injuries because of their traffickers. So they might not get prenatal care. They might have broken bones and not come in for help. They might have strep throat and not come in for assistance. And so when they do come in later and we talk about their medical history, that shame sometimes that I've had clients say, well, why wouldn't you come in? Why wouldn't you get help for that? Or what's wrong with you? And so those are things that we sometimes just do in our professions, not thinking about how those words or those interactions, when they do come in, really impact them. But knowing that they are going to come in late or not at all for some of their medical needs, because that control that someone else has over them.
So we're going to spend just the last part of our presentation talking about identifying and addressing needs. And again, we're still learning. We learn from our clients. We learn from our experience. We're constantly drilling and calling each other going, oh my goodness, or I'll have a case and I'll have to debrief about it. So when Melissa and I sit and it's like, all right, what do we need to do to get the word out? Because it's all about primary prevention, right? And then some secondary and some tertiary, right? But it's all about primary prevention. We need to do more of that. And that's why I love doing these kind of things, because medical professionals, there are studies, there is a ton of studies out there, and Price Nelson did a great job. We are so uniquely positioned in every portal of entry. I told you, many of them 88% come in contact with medical professionals. Remember that one slide I wanted you to remember? They may be victims of sexual violence, of exploitation, of trafficking, domestic violence. Awareness and education are so critical for our practice. And this is the first step. And these kind of statistics kind of bring it home to you. The feelings of shame and guilt will prevent people from disclosing. You have to understand that, you have to accept that, but being a human is super important. In healthcare, we have a lot of mnemonics. I'm sure in social work we do too, to remember stuff, right? There's an identification take home. So this helps you with documentation, so that when we go back to our Epic or our Meditech or whatever it is that we use, and we see that this patient's been flagged for being here so many times, the observe mnemonic, which I'm not going to read it to you, is a really good first step for documenting what we see, right? To include the behaviors, to include the environmental stuff, who are they with, how they presented, all those things that we do already in our practice, but just a little bit more to include the variety of health issues. But the big one, E, what do they exhibit? What is their behavior? Again, all victims of trauma, and you can do the research, exhibit behavior as a survival mechanism or learned mechanism as well. So don't always, throw them aside, no matter how they look and how they present, right?
Yeah, and I would say too, with the observe acronym here, one thing to keep in mind with the English language barrier, we can help with translators as well in our program. But one thing we should have talked about with data is with sex trafficking, majority of our victims are actually residents of North Dakota. And so I think there's this stereotype with victims always, being shipped from another country and held against their will in handcuffs and chains. And certainly can that trafficking happen? Sure, but that's not what we see here, as we've talked about today. We see majority of our labor trafficking victims that we've worked with, not from the United States, but come here legally. But majority of the victims of human trafficking, as we saw in that graph, almost 50% are white or Caucasian. And part of that is because our residents are the ones being trafficked here as well.
Yeah, you're so good, because see, I came from Washington, D.C. Okay. So I've been to North Dakota for now 7 years, going on my 8th year for love. When I found that much of what we see here in North Dakota specifically is familiar, homegrown. And that, and I came from a city mentality, and I live in Dickinson, okay, small town mentality, everybody knows everybody. And we all know that lack of anonymity in our profession is tough, because people won't report, or they'll go to another county or another state for care. Trust me, I've seen that in my profession, even in DC. So very good that you brought that up, because we don't want to accept, and people told me since I was an outsider, we don't have this problem here, and we do, and it's alarming. But North Dakota does a phenomenal job with education and awareness. So we are ahead of the DCs, the Baltimores, and the Massachusetts. Sorry if there's anybody in the audience from there, but we do a good job because of programs and trainings like this. Because as Melissa and I have said over and over again, IDing these patients, these clients, these victims, these survivors is tough, because it's got to be on their terms, honestly. And they'll tell you, and we do train with survivors, and we've had lived experiences of our own. And many of you probably have had that nurse ratchet, I'm just going to put myself out there, or that good physician, or that person that took time to say, hey, you don't deserve this, or hey, I'm here. You're going to go back to that provider. Okay. So again, these people may have been failed by the system, by us. And remember that Hippocratic oath that we took in all of our healthcare professions is to heal and to listen and not do harm, And how we do harm is when we don't take the time to treat each individual as a human, as somebody who could be our family member.
Well, and with that, they aren't going to come to you and say, hi, I'm a victim of human trafficking. Will you help me today? And so it's going to be rare that they even acknowledge this or understand this themselves, or even have a label for what's happening to them. And so that's why it's our job just to be supportive and offer those resources. And they have been filled by the system in a variety of ways. Perhaps they came forward and they gave their testimony, which could be triggersome and traumatic. But
you and
maybe
I are going through that.
Yes, but then maybe we don't have enough to prosecute. So they feel like we failed them, right? Or we've had individuals who do go to a medical provider, and then they get asked really inappropriate or invasive questions. One client was asked how much money she makes every day being prostituted by a doctor. So thinking about what is a failure to them by the system, and why would that inhibit them from wanting to come forward again? Often it's traffickers too, basing it on half truths. It's labor trafficking victims being told it's against the law to quit a job, right? That aren't from here and don't know that. Or traffickers saying, hey, you are going to be in trouble with law enforcement because you did A, B, and C, and you're a criminal now. So understanding that they don't have the full perspective or truth, so they're programmed to fear us in those ways.
Yeah, because then people, and us, even judgy, I've been there, is, well, why don't you leave the life? I mean, look at you. And again, it's all the stuff that we've talked about that are summarized in these next two slides is nah, I'm okay, or I can get out, I'll make just enough, I'm in control. But then add drugs to the mix, add learned helplessness, add lack of control, lack of education, being denied medical care. Those are all huge barriers that cause issues.
I just want to talk too about a client I had with that denial piece is such a big one, because who wants to admit that the person they love is taking advantage of them? And I had a client who said, I can't go to therapy. I can't focus on what's happened to me. I have to stay in my bubble of denial because I am not going to be able to take care of my children. If I go, she basically said, I'm terrified to even relive my trauma to get through therapy because I have to go home and be a mom after that. And I prefer to just deny what's happened for my own protection. And so thinking about that, it's a way to protect their own emotions in their heart when they go through things like this. So you'll see that a lot with the barriers. We have a tough time with housing, huge problem with housing. We have fantastic shelters to work with here in the state. We just know there's not enough. And as medical providers, we know that. We've had individuals that we've worked with in our program who've been discharged from a hospital to homelessness, or to the hotel where they were trafficked at, because there's nowhere for them to go. And so we always say to contact us in those moments, but that's a huge barrier for clients. It's also a reason they stay in the life, because maybe they've got a criminal record, and they can't afford housing or get housing without being purchased for sex. Or in labor, another indicator too, or a barrier, is they might live in really small quarters with a lot of people. They don't have a choice. Maybe there's 20, I shouldn't say 20, a family of 10 that lives in a 2-bedroom apartment, or 10 workers that live together in a small space. So it's always a barrier with the housing. And that limited resources, we always want to be culturally appropriate, which can be difficult sometimes in our state. But thinking about what they might need culturally, that's different than what you as a person would want or need. And again, the appropriate treatment. Oftentimes we refer people to organizations or agencies that have a short wait list, but they might not be trauma informed in the way that a human trafficking victim needs, or they might not even have training on human trafficking. So where are we referring these victims, and are they culturally appropriate? Are they trauma informed in the human trafficking sense? And understanding that they're going to disassociate with their experience. And that's part of what we need to work through as a barrier.
Yeah. And always medication. I mean, I'm that holistic practitioner. Not always medication is the right answer. We need to come up with better treatments. Mental health, that is a hot topic throughout the United States and throughout the world, basically. And with COVID, we've had some really great improvements as far as the telehealth perspective of it. So I'm hoping that takes more providers get involved in that. But understanding, as she said, is that the trauma is extremely complex, hence why we have our own ICD-10 code. So there are tons of needs. This is why it has to be a team approach from the moment they walk in, and it's the person checking them in, to the discharge instructions and the follow-up that a case management or social worker work. It takes an entire tribe or team to deal with all these needs. But the big one when we see them is safety first. And again, your interaction has to be the thing that you focus on. Your interventions have to be, and then reassess, right? The nursing process. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, but the intervention is where you're going to have the success. Hey, if there's something going on, you can call me, or I know who I can talk to help you. You don't deserve this. Language has power. That's all I have to say about that. And of course, addressing people's basic needs, like that blanket, that magic warm blanket that comes out of the warmer, is huge power. It's a great win for many of you. And those graham crackers with peanut butter totally works with a lot of our patients too.
In social worky world, we call this like wraparound, right? Yeah. And so part of what we'll talk about next in our protocol is that wraparound approach, and ensuring that victims and clients and patients have access to all of these things with a team of people who are together in a space to communicate about who is doing what, whose role is what, and are we meeting every single need that this client has. So the list goes on and on. I mean, it could get really tangible down to, we can do the housing, we can do the English language assistance, we can get more specific about the needs of victims, and that's what we do in our teams, and we have funding to assist us or to supplement the needs that they have as well.
And having patience, I love that you put that in there.
Yes,
patience, because that one person that comes over and over and over again to see you, ask them why. It may be loneliness, but there may be something else. Again, now you've got a lot of information. You may remember 1 or 2 slides. So what now? So Melissa and I are going to take this short amount of time to explain to you what your resources, what the access of things to help you do your job, because we do have specific deliverables, right? We have core measures. We have all these things that we have to do in our practice. So when you encounter somebody who's a victim of a crime, who could be trafficking, it could be, you just don't know. Melissa and I are going to kind of tell you, here's what you can access.
Well, and you all might not see this in your role about what happens behind the scenes once you contact and refer to our human trafficking program. And so typically what Anna Lena and I will see is medical provider, law enforcement, or someone in the community will contact us as the first point of contact. Sometimes we get contacted through our task force website, and our website has tons of resources, information, data, all of the things that you might need. So sometimes people get a hold of us through the website. Either way, somebody suspects human trafficking, depending on where they're at in the state, myself, Anna Lena, or our other navigator would be the first point of contact. And it's our job really to get the ball rolling. And so we get releases of information. We make sure that we have approvals we need either from the client or the client's legal guardian to move forward with any type of discussion or meeting. Has a child abuse and neglect report been filed? And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. But any suspected human trafficking of a child in our state, whether from a caregiver or not caregiver, should be reported. And so it's our job to ensure that whoever is suspecting the trafficking has reported a 960 or child abuse and neglect report. From there, we coordinate a response. So we ensure that we know the correct team members to be involved with that client, what their needs are, and use that multidisciplinary approach to follow up with a meeting. So then Anna Lena and I would facilitate a meeting to say, you know, what happened? What do we know? Where did the referral come from? Has that report been filed? Who is all involved with this person? And then it's our role too to follow up with that team and have that ongoing communication as we need it for that case. And so with that, it's important to note that we are a person-centered agency. And so at some point in this process, victims have a voice because ultimately they should be in the driver's seat of their meetings, of their goals, and of that conversation. Sometimes those initial meetings do not include clients if there's confidential information about other potential clients or an investigation. However, we would introduce them to the team and listen to their questions and their goals. And we identify our human trafficking advocate or case manager who's going to be communicating all of that to the client.
Because eventually the response needs, I just had a call with a provider and she's like, I had no idea we could call a team of people throughout the state to help me with this individual. And I said, oh yeah, you know, welcome. That tells me again, we need to spread the word. But the big thing that I wanted you to know is that we have all these great protocols and whatnot. Identifying is important, reporting. Not one single report that you report to the law enforcement or to us goes unlooked at, or I can't even think the word now. Unnoticed. Thank you. Because it's that one that we don't is the one that is. So I learned this from Homeland Security, from some of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation agents. They'll look at every case. They may not find something, but they'll look at every case and put it on a burner to keep in the back in case the names comes up or something comes up as well. There's a lot of reports out there. We're all mandated reporters in our field, right? So we all know about the 960. Filling out the 960, hey, I suspect trafficking or I suspect something, you know, safety, whatever. We all have been trained heavily. And if we haven't, that's another class that we could do. But 960s are super important. We need that paper trail. And I know everyone knows about that. Even if you suspect domestic violence or what, it needs to be reported because that freaking piece of paper has to generate an investigation. That's hard for us as providers when we're like taking care of the patient and then have to do all that creepy paperwork.
And what I've heard from medical providers too is some concern about, will I stay anonymous? Is there any danger for me? And we always say absolutely. And you can always, you know, change these. You can call myself or Anna Lena first, and then we can talk you through some of those questions about what to report. Should you report it? What does that look like? So you can always call us before you report, but that's going to be a conversation we have as a team. And then from there, we discuss, you know, is a response team meeting, that multidisciplinary team meeting, appropriate? Do we have ROIs or the releases of information we need? And then sometimes there are those ethical dilemmas about, you know, this is a patient of mine I see all the time. I don't want to have to report them. I'm scared they won't come back. Or, you know, we need to talk about this individual before they can even be invited to the meeting. So know that it makes us human, and it is okay to have some ethical dilemmas or some concerns around these things. But that's why we want to discuss as a team is providing that support to one another through those dilemmas that we all feel in our own disciplines when we get together and work through these cases. And I just want to say too, safe harbor law, if you're wondering, we haven't touched much on that, but CSEC means that commercial sexual exploitation of children in terms of when you would report suspected trafficking. Safe harbor is the law that protects youth from being looked at as a criminal. So that was only enacted in about 2015, where if youth are exchanged for sex, they are not looked at as a delinquent or a prostitute. Now they are looked at as a victim offered supportive services. So that's where the law changed, where now we report human trafficking is that safe harbor law. And every state has a little different verbiage in their safe harbor law, and some states don't even have that protection for youth at all. So just keeping that in mind too with these reports.
Yep. When I spoke at places down south and they're like, you have a safe harbor law? How do we do that? Right. And so we do have some good legislators out there that this is seen as extremely progressive for the state of North Dakota. So kudos to North Dakota for that. The ethical dilemma. So again, mandated reporter I am. Melissa's a mandated reporter too. HIPAA always comes up as a concern. Again, when it's about safety, that's why the paperwork, the 960, when it's something about safety, we do such a great job with child abuse, and we do such a great job with domestic violence. We need to do a better job at reporting as well any suspected trafficking or exploitation from labor or sex. So as good as we are now with that, we need to raise the bar a little bit and do that as well.
And always call us with questions. We want everyone to know whether you're working with a youth or adult that you suspect is trafficked. We always say, just call us. We are here to answer questions. A huge part of our job is that technical assistance piece of just being available to you. So know that regardless of the situation, if you're unsure, if you suspect something, you can call us and we can brainstorm it together.
Yeah. And, we're going to leave you with some parting thoughts. Remember, why did you get into this work? I constantly have to remind myself as well. And take care of myself too. And I'm proud to be a nurse. I'm proud to be a human trafficking navigator, a victim, a specialist when it comes to victims of crime. We're all specialists in our field, right? And so we can never have too much learning. It is our patients and our clients who are the best teachers. So as we listen to a mom who's complaining about their child who sounds croupy and we think it's a different diagnosis, we always teach our younger generation, listen to the parent, listen, open your eyes, you use all your senses, because they have perceptions. We also have perceptions too. So you're educating yourself now, right? So you're learning how to tame your attitude perhaps, and how to see things a different way. These clients, these patients present so differently, but also very similar to the things that we quote see all the time. But those see all the time people have had some sort of trauma in their life, so we owe it to them to explore and peel back that layer as well. And then verbal, nonverbals. And I know we learn this in school, we learn this in our practice. Nonverbals, the eye rolling, it still gets me. And when people do it to me, I'm like, it makes me feel this small. And maybe it's not intentional. Maybe you've had we're so histrionic. I know I can speak for nurses. Oh, we've had a bad day. We're short. A patient doesn't want to hear that. They're here. I'm number one right now. Okay. So remember that your nonverbals go a long way with these patients.
And I would say too, that having some bias around things doesn't make us bad humans. It makes us human. We all have them. It's that awareness of how we treat people when we are being challenged in those ways that we feel bias about. And so I always tell people and leave them with the thought of, how would it feel to work with you? If you came into yourself to get medical attention, how would that interaction feel? And remembering that with every interaction, especially when our patience runs thin, and having patience with yourself, because these are very difficult cases.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The other thing, of course, in an emergency, you don't certainly have to try to scramble and find mine and Annalena's numbers, but if there's an emergency, still go through your typical routine or policy there. Another option for you all, you can certainly call Annalena and I, but as a community member too, if you're seeing anything you feel is reportable, our Bureau of Criminal Investigations has a slick tip line. You can also find this on our North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force website. It's another place just to report something that you're seeing. It might not even be in the medical profession. It might be you saw something that was suspicious trafficking and you happen to see a license plate and you just want to make sure somebody looks into that or documents that in their system. That's a space that you could also report things online quickly, that it's going to be looked at very quickly, because we
Yeah.
have someone on that all the time. And again, it's documented in the system that we're able to utilize for human trafficking cases as well.
And let me tell you, a small little clinic in Western North Dakota, I did a training and they went, it was all nurses, and they all went to that tip line and have actually uncovered some stuff that was kind of questionable. And to this day, they wear that invisible badge of like, hey, I spotted it. It was all about education. It's all about awareness. It was anonymous. They didn't know they were doing the right thing. It's super user friendly. I wanted to quote them. You know, I didn't get a chance to quote them on this or do a video on them, but they're like super easy. And it also made them feel that they were contributing towards mitigating all this within our community. So that tip line, super helpful. There's really brilliant people who manage that. And then also the trafficking hotline. We have lots of flyers, pamphlets that we're developing specific to healthcare through the task force, that you can reach out and we can have those in your waiting rooms, something you can hand out that's very discreet. That's very discreet. The National Domestic Violence Hotline works very closely with our trafficking task force throughout the United States. There's always a human that answers, which is great. And then they have a phenomenal, the trafficking hotline has a text option too, because sometimes timing, and this is great. And some survivors have used it as well.
Yeah, it's a great resource even for data updates, information, programs in other states. So if you're just interested in more medical information around trafficking, they would have different articles and things on that there as well. With that, here's our contacts. Thank you all. Certainly reach out if you want additional resources. We have tons and tons and tons of things. Share this training with other people. And again, we want to thank NDSU and this partnership with the Human Trafficking Task Force and as well OVC, Office of Victims of Crime, where federal funding comes from.
Thank you.